Okay, so I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar, and thank you all for coming, for taking this time to come and attend this lovely seminar series that's been organised by the Whitaker Cluster. And thanks first of all to Angela and to Courtney for organising this lovely seminar series. I found that dipping into this and actually having a chance to develop something to present, it's really made me feel and reminded me that I am part of an academic community in the middle of all this social distancing and all this keeping apart. So it's been a lovely experience in that sense. So first of all, about me, I'm Dr. Orla McGarry, and I'm a lecturer in the School of Political Science and Sociology here in NUI Galway. And I have been working as a postdoctoral researcher for the past probably, or not for, I've been working as a researcher in the field of migration for the past maybe 11 years. So I've worked as a postdoc in all of the universities on the Western Seaboard of Ireland, in UCC, in UL, and here in NUI Galway on various different projects. And my focus has generally been on migration. So this has given me an opportunity to really engage with the experience of being a migrant in Ireland, and also to engage with it from a range of different perspectives through the various projects that I've been part of. And what I'm really hoping to do in this talk, and what I'm hoping to achieve in this talk, is to take some space to really review on a macro sense and in an overall sense, the learning that I can take across all of these 7 different postdoctoral and PhD projects. Because I found that as a postdoctoral researcher, you're often very focused on the next deadline ahead of you. And what's been very valuable about preparing this webinar is it's given me some space to step back and really reflect on the overall learning. So I'm going to give a presentation on the negotiations of intercultural engagement and engage with some critical issues that I see arising in migration policy in an Irish context. And after this presentation, we'll be having a discussion section. So you'll see a question and answers panel at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any answers or sorry, any questions as I go along through the presentation, if you could just make note of these here, and then during the discussion section, we'll visit the question and answer panel, and we'll be able to incorporate these into your discussion or into the discussion section. So I think it's a good idea to always open by setting the scene and by really establishing in broad brushstrokes the history or the story of Irish migration. So 1996, I would locate as a key year in the story of net Irish in migration. So this is the first year that the CSO, the census, recorded net inward migration in Ireland. We've traditionally been a country associated with emigration, but in 1996, the census recorded that the scene was really changing here, and that we were having more people arriving into the country and more levels of ethnic diversity than were actually emigrating at the time. This is largely due to the Celtic Tiger and the economic boom and the employment prospects that are created by this, which are very attractive to migrants from a range of backgrounds, including highly qualified migrants who came to work in the IT and in the pharmaceutical sectors in Ireland, as well as being attractive to returning Irish migrants who wanted to come back home to re-establish their lives in Ireland, having emigrated at earlier phases. The 1990s also saw an expansion in the extent to which asylum seekers were arriving in Ireland. It expanded from only a handful of migration or asylum claims in the early 1990s to over 7,000 asylum claims by 1999. So really the latter part of the 90s and the Celtic Tiger really changed the scene and the trajectory of migration in Ireland. Before moving on to our next milestone of 2008, there's a few other dates that are kind of important to make note of. In 2002, we established the direct provision system, which was established at that stage as a very temporary emergency response to the number of asylum seekers that we needed to accommodate in the country, and is still alive and well, or is still alive anyway. All these years later. And also 2004 is a milestone year also, in that this marks the year of the citizenship referendum, where we made access to the Irish citizenship for migrants a lot more restrictive. And also this is the year that the labour markets, Irish labour markets, were opened up to the accession countries to migrants from the countries who had newly joined the European Union. So what we're seeing here really is a change, a gradual change in our attitudes towards migration, and maybe a change in the attitudes towards defining what type of migrants we want to encourage to come and what kind of migrants we really want to discourage from coming to Ireland. So 2008 brings us to the very famous now economic crash. So here we saw a fall in levels of net inward migration and a rise in outwards migration. So we're no longer a country, at this point, we no longer are a country of net inwards migration. But it's very important to note here that migration did not stop during the recession. It continued just at lower levels. In 2014, Ireland re-emerged as a destination for migrants and return Irish migrants. And that brings us forward all the way to 2020, at the point at which all bets are off, and we'll have to revisit in a seminar series some other year. So here is our latest snapshot of diversity in Ireland. And this graph really depicts in a glance what the makeup and the breakdown of the Irish population in terms of ethnic diversity and nationality. So as we can see here, this segment represents roughly 12% of the Irish population, and this is accounted for by people who are born of other national origins other than Irish. So it's a sizable slice of our population. If we look here into how this is further broken down, we can see that UK nationals and Polish nationals account for the largest segments of this 12%, with other Eastern European backgrounds also heavily represented, and also Brazilian. But what's really of interest here is this other segment here. And within this other segment here, we have a variety of over 32 different nationalities. So this really points out that not only have we got a large number of people living in the country who are migrating inwards, who are not Irish nationals, but also that they come from a huge variety of different geographical backgrounds. And the term diversity, in some senses, it's a little bit inadequate to capture what's happening demographically and how these demographic shifts are affecting the Irish population. So rather, I like to use the term super diversity here. And by super diversity, I denote a multidimensional sense of diversity. So Irish migrants, in line with processes of globalization, migrants who are coming to Ireland are coming from a greater range of transnational backgrounds. They're coming from a greater range of geographic backgrounds because it's easier to travel. Flights are more accessible. They're coming from a greater range of socioeconomic backgrounds because transport and communication across the globe is that little bit easier. So we have more diversity in people who who traditionally migration would have been for people of greater economic means. Now it's more accessible for other groups also. And also we're seeing much greater variations in the age group of migrants, in gender of migrants, and the levels of education and levels of human capital of migrants. So it's no longer the successful people who are doing well, can afford to leave, can afford to migrate, that it might have been traditionally. We're now getting people of all ages, of all levels of education, taking to migration. On top of this, and this is already a huge diversification of the profile of migration, we are also seeing a process whereby migrants are separated out through segmented channels and modes of mobility. So our policies, our migration policies, and the way we decide who can access who can access our countries and who can come in and who must stay out, and on what terms they can access this creates a further um, uh, a further level of diversity. So you can imagine the difference between somebody who arrives in Ireland as an asylum seeker and has to apply for asylum and goes through the direct provision system until their application is processed. And this would be hugely contrasted with somebody who comes in as a European migrant to work in the highly vaunted technology centre, or somebody who gets a green card to come and work in the pharmaceutical sector from abroad. So the experience of how you were received in Ireland and in the receiving country more generally globally, it really diffracts the experiences of migrants, and it creates a greater difference than even that which would have been experienced up to the point of entry. So being latecomers to the field of net migration, we're also latecomers to the field of migration policy. So you can see that we are here. Ireland is located here in interculturalism, which is the most recent iteration of a migration policy paradigm. And for better or for worse, we have escaped and we have sidestepped the mistakes, but also some of the learning from earlier iterations of migration policy. So the earliest formalized migration policy would be assimilation. And assimilation was a policy that expected to put an onus on migrants to abandon their cultural and their ethnic identities and to really suppress this and to embrace the cultural and ethnic identity or the cultural identity of the dominant host society into which they're arriving in order to integrate, in order to get on in the society. And assimilation was succeeded by multiculturalism globally, really from the 1960s. And multiculturalism was a big change from assimilation into the valorized group and ethnic identity, and it seeks to enable communities to advocate for the place within the whole. So multiculturalism then, moving forward, has been largely displaced since the last 15 to 20 years by interculturalism, which is a new policy paradigm and has become the dominant policy paradigm globally. So what exactly do we mean by interculturalism? Interculturalism is ostensibly about a celebration of difference. It emphasizes dialogue among cultures with a view to ensuring wider and balanced cultural exchanges in favor of intercultural respect and a culture of peace. So it's absolutely about a celebration of cultural difference. Interculturalism is also highly critical of multiculturalist policies. Indeed, these are a mainstay and these are an important part of its formulation. However, it's largely been criticized for its lack of clarity, and it's seen that there's a lack of clarity around what exactly interculturalism as a policy paradigm does represent. And this lack of clarity in the rhetoric of interculturalism I see as very problematic, given the breadth of its influence and given the extent to which national and concrete policies are formulated on the intercultural paradigm. So it's worth really kind of distilling down into this lack of clarity and what exactly is meant by interculturalism a little bit more. So while interculturalism is largely seen as the current policy paradigm and as having replaced multiculturalism as the paradigm of choice, the debate still rages on. In fact, there's a continuous war of words, and there has been over the last 20 years. So the jury is still out on whether or not multiculturalism and interculturalism can really be seen as being that different, and whether or not interculturalism is an improvement on multiculturalism, or is it just a recasting of many of the same issues? Multiculturalism, to visit that in a little bit more detail, has its genesis as a political theory, which came to the fore in the 1960s in tandem with the civil rights movements. So as a political theory, it has evolved from the traditions of liberalism. It really places an emphasis on the rights of ethnic and national minorities, and it sees group representation as being key to political claims making. And because of its genesis from liberalism, it's very much concerned with inequality and issues of redistribution, and the political claims makings of group representation are key to the advocacy and are key to the process of redistribution and representation and tackling the inequalities with which migrants are faced. Interculturalism, on the other hand, has quite a different story in terms of genesis. So interculturalism in its European iteration, the genesis is largely associated with the Cantle Report of 2001. And this is a report by the UK Home Office following disturbances in Northern English towns of diverse ethnic minority with large South Asian populations. Ted Cantle from the British Home Office conducted an investigation into the causes of these disturbances. And the report, which is very widely cited, noted that people living within ethnic minority communities were effectively living in parallel societies. So they were so cut off and so caught within their ethnic silos that they were oblivious to what was happening with the outside world and the thoughts of how, and they were cut off and disconnected from the sense of a national whole and from a sense of cohesion, or a sense of social cohesion. And the blame, according to the Cantle report, for this largely fell on past policies of multiculturalism, which has emphasized group identity to the exclusion of dialogue and to the exclusion of bringing people together to celebrate diversity and to really engage in discourse and discussion. So in order to counter this, interculturalism really exposes the idea of grassroots and community cohesion, the idea that dialogue must take place at a local level between people living in communities, and that this bottom-up process is how community cohesion is and intercultural cohesion is to be achieved. And rather than focusing on groups as the unit of advocacy, it really purports individual freedoms to be the thing that's very important. So interculturalism, it's one of the main criticisms that can be levered at interculturalism is that it's reactive to the perceived failure of multicultural societies. But of course, advocates of multiculturalism, such as Tariq Madood and Nira Madood, they point out that interculturalism is reacting to a stereotype of multicultural policies, that at no point did multiculturalism actually advocate ethnic silos and a lack of dialogue. The dialogue has always been key to it. So that this is a misrepresentation of multiculturalism on which this entire paradigm has come to be based. And between the war of words and between the academic debates on it, it's actually very difficult at times to extrapolate what exactly the difference is. So Zapata Barrero, in a 2017 article, I think captured with the most clarity the 4 pillars on which interculturalism is really based. So there's an emphasis on communication and dialogue across ethnic boundaries. And one of the main differences, or one of the main focal points here, is the local level. So rather than multiculturalism, which talked about national level advocacy and looked to make changes at a macro level, at a national level, interculturalism places a real emphasis on local engagements and local interactions and local empowerments. Rather than being a political theorist and rather being the focus of academic work, interculturalism has a concrete policy focus. And it shows a preference for pragmatism and compromise rather than strict principled reasoning. And a core advantage to interculturalism over multiculturalism, according to Zapata Barrero, is a non-ideological diction, which gives it cross-party appeal. So it appeals to everybody, so to speak. So interculturalism, since its genesis in the early 2000s and a little bit before that in Canada, it has had a meteoric rise in terms of becoming a policy paradigm and in terms of being catapulted into a prominent position on the policy stage. So in 2008, the Council of Europe published a white paper on intercultural dialogue and the UNESCO World Report on Cultural Diversity. Both highlighted interculturalism as a key paradigm and as the key way forward and the key way of repairing some of the damage that had been done by past failings of multicultural policy. Crucially, many multiculturalists point out no concrete evidence was actually given for what these failings really were, or that that perceived failings in society had been caused by multiculturalism. But nonetheless, these are 2 really influential platforms on which interculturalism was embraced as the way forward and as the best basis on which national policies could be based. So following this, national policies around Europe, in Canada and in North America and in Australia all came to be based on the paradigm of interculturalism. So now to turn our gaze back to Ireland and to really focus in on what interculturalism has meant here in terms of policy development. So our earliest body which was established to really deal with integration and policy was the National Consultative Committee on Racism and Interculturalism. Now this committee is based on 5 pillars, which actually, 1, protection from racism, the 2nd, economic inclusion, full participation and recognition of diversity and diversity in service provision. So while many commentators, such as Jerry Butcher, really point out that, you know, the lack of implementation and the lack of follow-on and distilling down of these steps into concrete policy and implementation focal points means that our integration policy from the get-go was actually quite laissez-faire. Other commentators, such as Riley, highlight that it's rooted in the discourse of human rights and that it's actually quite a comprehensive address of the numerous and systematic obstacles facing migrants as they negotiate their place within Irish society. In 2008, with the crash, the NCCRI was disbanded and it was replaced. Our responsibility for integration and migrant reception was transferred to the Office for the Promotion of Migrant Integration, or the OPMI, which had been established in 2007 as a junior ministry. And this is, I think, an important turning point here because we see a change in the rhetoric in the outputs of this. So one of the flagship publication of the OPMI was Migration Nation in 2008. And this really puts forward the view that integration needs to be a two-way process, that the onus is on Irish society and Irish people to go out there and be welcoming, but there's an equal, if not greater, onus on migrants to negotiate their own integration and negotiate their own positioning within Irish society. So it's really advocating for a high level of grassroots activity to get this integration and to get interculturalism going. Otherwise, the achievements of the OPMI are reporting to international bodies on our commitments in terms of racism and anti-racism measures, and coordinating our unambitious response to the refugee crisis, and also a commitment to celebrating diversity and celebrating identity. So really we're seeing a change in rhetoric where there's more of an emphasis on grassroots interculturalism, and really celebrating things that are coming upwards from migrant communities, and less focus on top-down and provision of services and provision of services, and less of a comprehensive view and less awareness of the challenges facing migrants coming into Ireland. And in 2020, responsibility for integration was again moved into a newly regrouped Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. And while with the current pandemic, all bets are off and how this will fare, initial reactions from NGOs and from advocacy groups have expressed concern about the extent to which this department could be equipped to actually achieve equality and to forward the interests of many migrant groups, particularly more vulnerable migrants. So now I would really like to turn my attention to just drawing on some reflections from my experience in conducting research with migrant groups in various settings around Ireland. As I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I have worked on several different postdoctoral research projects with migrants, and I have had this has given me an opportunity to work with various migrant groups from across the spectrum, from the most vulnerable to some of the most successful in Irish society, and look at the various geographic settings, but also to analyze migrant experience from different perspectives because of the nature of the different types of research projects that I've been involved in, from evaluation to contributing as a member of an international consortium on Horizon 2020 projects. And so to draw some overarching points from this learning, I'm going to begin on quite a positive note, and I'm going to say that this grassroots interculturalism on which we are really pinning our hopes in Ireland, it does exist. It's not a unicorn, it's not a fabrication, it's not a fairy story. Beautiful grassroots interculturalism as negotiated by individuals on an ad hoc basis as part of their daily lives, it certainly does exist. And by grassroots, I mean organic processes where individuals in the process of just living their lives and negotiating their biographies and their identities, they engage in this type of dialogue across difference, and they build up cohesion in this way, and they negotiate biographies and they negotiate their lives where they can build on common attributes and shared strengths, as well as seeing their own diversity and their difference as something that gives them strength and which improves their experience at living in Ireland. So when I was conducting my PhD research, my PhD in Ballyhonus in County Mayo, I worked with and I engaged with teenage members of the local Muslim population to examine their experience of identity formation. So I effectively wanted to find out how they managed to be Muslim and to be from an ethnic group other than Irish, but still, what was it that they needed to do to adapt to and to get on in Irish society, and what this meant to them in terms of their personal identities. And I really was lucky, and I had some heartwarming experiences of hearing narratives of young people who had really managed to negotiate their way in Irish society and to embed themselves within Irish society while still retaining the things that made them feel special and the things that they viewed as valuable about their ethnic identity. So a particularly lovely example was the way that many of the teenage male participants in this study from the Pakistani community in the town viewed their their participation in the GAA club, in the local GAA club. So um, because they're in the GA club, they felt that they had made it in Irish society. It was a source of friendships and they got to know everybody. But more importantly and more significantly for me for that was that they viewed their success on the GA pitch and within the GA club as stemming very much from their repertoire of skills that they took from their ethnic community. So they said that, so they believed that they're especially good at hurling and other GA skills because they came from a community where cricket was played, and because some of them had spent early years in Pakistan playing cricket with their families. So, you know, catching the ball, hitting the ball at speed, it all makes us, it makes us better at playing hurling. And another really lovely example of this was when they described their use of Punjabi, their ethnic language, as a lingua franca on the hurling pitch. So one participant described to me that he plays in goals, and his other friend is in the fullbacks, and his other friend is in the halfbacks, and there's another one in another friend from the community was in the fullbacks. So we just talk in our language. So having Punjabi as a lingua franca between and that enabled them to just really get in there and to discuss their tactics and shout to each other and give each other calls on the pitch without the opposition hearing them. So they saw this as a strategy that really helped their performance on the hurling pitch and helped them to outwit and outfox the opposition. So another possibly less talked about manifestation of successful intercultural engagement, which I was lucky enough to have an opportunity to engage with during my research, was when I was working as part of the Y Mobility Horizon 2020 consortium in UCC. And as part of this project, we were investigating the experiences of intra-EU migrants who had come to Ireland to work, often in the technology sector, and to really investigate how they got on with intercultural society with very few policy cues, and how they negotiated their way in Irish society. So the way they describe themselves and the way they describe their lifestyles and their lives in Ireland really spoke to me of cosmopolitanism, where all human beings belong to a single community based on shared morality. So in this definition, or this type of cross-cultural dialogue, diversity is so normal and so accepted that it's barely remarked upon. It just is. So cosmopolitan places where individuals openly and enthusiastically engage with multiple forms of cultural and social difference was a really good description for many of the workplaces in which they described their lives being lived. So they described their workplaces as high inclusion environments, diversity very important, very much respected and understood. So here was something where diversity wasn't complicated. You didn't need to think about your diversity and how to disguise your diversity or how you were going to bring it to the fore. It just was. Everybody had an ethnic background. Everybody had a diverse cultural background, and this made the overall workplace stronger and more interesting. Um, Very interestingly, as part of this research, we were explicitly examining how these migrants engaged with policies in Ireland, and there was an almost ubiquitous lack of awareness of migration policy and also lack of awareness of other policies in an Irish context. So in terms of healthcare, many of these migrants are in terms of healthcare and those types of policies, many of these migrants just sidestep that, because when they needed healthcare, they needed to access healthcare, they just flew home to their home countries rather than engaging with our waiting times and our overstrapped health and our overstrapped facilities. And similarly, on many of the companies which they come to work, they'd help them bypass and help them negotiate their way through policies and to get themselves settled. So there was almost a blindness here, and it meant that the laissez-faire intercultural policy field, which is problematic for other migrants, didn't really affect these type of highly qualified migrants of high human capital who were well integrated into their workplaces. So while undoubtedly, and it's wonderful that we can give positive examples of how laissez-faire approaches to interculturalism can nonetheless have successful outcomes for migrants, it's important in terms of balance to also acknowledge that it doesn't work for everybody, and that's the real problem here. A laissez-faire approach to interculturalism and to migrant integration, it's going to disproportionately affect the most vulnerable migrants. So when you put an emphasis on bottom up and you put the onus on migrants to really negotiate their own intercultural engagement, it is leaving the more vulnerable people who aren't effectively able to do this for a number of reasons in a position where they become more and more marginalized, more and more isolated, and less available, or less and less able to engage with crucial services. So my lovely narratives and the lovely heartwarming narratives of people engaging in the GAA and bringing their Punjabi as a lingua franca onto the hurling pitch, these are countered somewhat by the experiences of other teenagers living within the direct provision system, who were just experiencing stigma and social isolation, and they simply didn't even know where to start because of the stigma. They wouldn't even know where to go to try and engage with people, because what they needed was a helping hand and an open invitation. And without any concrete policies and without getting a helping hand, that wasn't available for them. One asylum seeker who was 16 years old and had been living in direct provision for, I think, 2 years, described coming to Ballyhonus in June. Between June and August, he didn't talk to anyone. That's just really, that just brings home how, how isolation could become entrenched from somebody at this young an age, and how vulnerable people can be when with lack of supports and lack of facilities. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that lack of opportunity for engagement and lack of amenities is something that can disproportionately affect migrant groups. Policies of dispersal, which see asylum seekers placed in rural areas with few amenities and few facilities, will often struggle in particular at having an opportunity to engage with people. And similarly in disadvantaged areas, where many migrant groups locate themselves when they first arrive. So these are the type of issues that are increasing in Ireland at the moment. I also had, as well as looking at grassroots and intercultural, I also had an opportunity to engage with some initiatives of targeted interculturalism. And for me, this is actually a very interesting idea and a very interesting way of approaching interculturalism. So I view targeted interculturalism as activities which are planned with intercultural engagement as an explicit goal. So as one of my postdoctoral research projects, I worked on an evaluation of Belong, which was a family support program which aimed to foster a sense of belonging among ethnic minority children in Northern Ireland. And as part of this, it was funded by Atlantic Philanthropies to make youth work interventions available for young children, and also educational supports to really aim to foster intercultural engagement among these children with people from both a Northern Irish background and people from other ethnic minority backgrounds. And a different approach to this, which I experienced while working on the Restore FP7 project, was involving migrants directly in intervention development. So in this project, the aim was to develop interventions which could overcome the barriers and the barriers that many migrants faced to accessing adequate healthcare. So in order to overcome this and to really involve migrants in a bottom-up process of intervention development, researchers from UL invited migrants to take part in participatory action research to identify, first of all, what the barriers were, but then to also play a central role in designing an intervention and a set of policies and practices that could be implemented across that could be implemented and shared with GPs and healthcare practitioners to enhance the way that they communicated and the way that interpreting was carried out in healthcare settings. So this is a really beautiful bottom-up way of seeing migrants come to the table and actually play a central role in negotiating and in developing the policies which shape their lives. So the issues which I did encounter with targeted interculturalism, and I think it's really wonderful to have had an opportunity to see it in practice and to see that here is an approach that can work. It really can facilitate bottom-up processes of interculturalism and cohesion building. However, it's very much limited in its current form in Ireland by its dependence on philanthropic and research funding schemes. Because of this, it is subject to funding continuation. So typically, research or targeted intercultural schemes, they'll be short term. They will go on ahead for as long as the funding holds up, but once the funding runs out, they will be discontinued. And this is a real shame in terms of the value of the learning being lost. And also this means that there are very few opportunities for mainstreaming. So because of the lack of a coherent top-down support process and a systematic process for supporting bottom-up interculturalism and targeted intercultural processes, it's very much patchy and very much limited to people who happen to be living within the area and migrants who happen to be lucky enough to access these type of facilities at the time. So finally, to bring me to conclusion, I suppose I'd like to conclude by revisiting the concept of superdiversity, which I spoke about at the beginning. So superdiversity, it denotes increasing in its current, when we look at superdiversity in Ireland, I find it a little bit worrying, and I have a little bit of an issue with the term because the term, it's playful, and I think it sounds almost like it should be wearing a cape, like it's something that's really wonderful. And while diversity is super, I think that the positive approach of super diversity and the rhetoric of it, it disguises the increasing levels of inequality in migrants' experience, both globally and in Ireland at the moment. So it's really important to remember that diversity is of the origins, but also because of the way that our laissez faire approach to interculturalism and to integration in Ireland, it's leading to more segmented outcomes and more differential outcomes for migrant groups across Ireland, which is really just creating more inequality within the population as a whole. I think that things that we need to be concerned about in terms of our intercultural approach are the focus on local level cross-community engagement, which in itself is a wonderful thing. But when it's not balanced with top-down measures and with a macro level approach, it is inadequate on its own to really address issues facing some of the more vulnerable groups. And this focus on micro level actions, it can often obscure national level issues such as racism, socioeconomic inequalities, and of course, direct provision. So I really think that there's a need going forward and really developing Ireland, which is becoming more diverse and which will continue to become more diverse. So I think that there's a need for a coherent and an open debate on migration policy that's inclusive of migrants, of policy actors, community practitioners and academics. And hopefully this will see us achieve intercultural cohesion in the future. Thank you. So I see that I have some questions in the questions and answer panel. So I'm going to visit these first of all. And if anybody has any more questions, please feel free to pop these into the question and answer, and I'll visit them also. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Valerie has asked, Valerie, thank you for this question. A question of why the US is omitted in the graph on the evolution of migration policy. And that's a very interesting point. And I suppose because the experience of the US, it diverges in a way from some of the main trends that I've noted globally, because very much the US, they focus on the idea of acculturation. And I suppose this is tending towards assimilation, and it's almost so dense that it requires a distillation and analysis on its own. But a very interesting point, and perhaps something I need to review in the way that I tell this. And also, and the question of, despite discourse of two-way integration, is the reality that many feel responsibility for positive integration rests with migrants? Well, that certainly is the rhetoric that I would read from the OPMI's publications on this. And I suppose also from the lack of top-down processes and the lack of top-down supports, I think would feed into this idea that the onus is on migrants to really negotiate their way into Irish society. And I have some interesting views on this from some of the follow-up work that I conducted in Ballyhonus, where the local GAA club got very interested in processes of interculturalism and engaging in interculturalism, and their success in doing this is actually the focus of a short film which is published on the website of The Guardian, which is viewed by over 1 million viewers, which really celebrated the intercultural diversity of the local GA club. But the local GA club, which procured intercultural funding to support intercultural events and to really try and broaden their remit and the way that they got into and to really enhance the way that migrants were enabled to engage with the local GA club. And it was really successful in facilitating more children from Eastern European groups in getting involved in the GAA. But one of the remits that they had is they really wanted to help people from the direct provision centre in the town in getting involved in the GAA club. But beyond putting on transportation for them to attend particular events, it was impossible to get them to engage in regular training sessions and to become part of the mainstream GAA, with some notable exceptions, of course, because of simple things like just lack of funding and lack of regular supports. So I think that's part of the issue with integration resting with the migrants. It's just so difficult for people who are more marginalized and more vulnerable. And George, thank you for your comment. So you have asked for further reading on Irish intercultural policy and being laissez-faire. As you'd not come across that idea before, and actually I'm going to just, there we go, and here's a bibliography. And so this will be available as part of the video on the website afterwards. So there's 2 pages of bibliography there, so hopefully you will find some further reading that interests you there. And if you don't, please feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to share any other reading sources with you for that. So I'm aware that it's lunchtime and it's midweek, and thank you and I'm very grateful to you for having taken the time to come and hear my seminar. So I'm going to, if we give it 1 more minute, if anyone has any further questions, please feel free to share, or if not, to follow up with me by email. Okay. So we can leave it there. So thanks again to everybody for coming. Oh, we have a question coming in. Thanks. Okay, so thanks to everybody very much for your attention again. It's been very enjoyable.